Hello everyone, I am Katie. I'm the lead technician in the Read Lab at Monell, and I'm going to be talking about two things that are near and dear to my heart: science and art. More specifically, I'm going to be discussing visual communication, especially related to communicating science. Underneath the concept of visual communication, we're going to hit on some topics of basic design and how to use some of the elements of design like color and spacing in an effective way. So let's start off by roasting my very first slide. It's extremely ineffective in a couple of ways. Firstly, we are in almost full sentence structure, which is a big no-no in a presentation, because I'm talking and explaining the sentences while you're trying to read the sentences. Most people can't listen and read separate information. So we are going to make the information easy to jump through, and then they will likely attend to the words coming out of my mouth. The way I like to break down information into slides is by sussing out a hierarchy of a bullet point list, so to speak. Visual communication is my top point, and then how this relates to science is a subpoint. Also, the basics of design is a subpoint. Underneath the basics of design, we can use space and colors. So now we've made this lovely little bullet point list much better. People can jump through that in just a few seconds and then listen to me go on and on about everything else. Another thing you might notice is we've created a big square blank space on the right side, and I'm all about using images to aid in communication. So let's put something there. Before we do, I want to say that my golden rule about this is that we need to put a helpful image, not just an image. Because although sometimes we view images on slides as meaningless reprieve, and we put nice little pictures of DNA to give a sciencey vibe, we can actually deepen understanding by using something more effective. My go-to example for describing this is, say that I was making a presentation about ducks, and I'm hitting you with some hot duck facts. Putting a picture of a duck, while admittedly adorable, is not really going to deepen our understanding of ducks or what I'm talking about. If I were talking about a very specific northeastern mallard duck, however, I'm going to throw that image in there because it's telling us something valuable and it contributes. I'm talking about this specific duck. Here's what it looks like. Okay, so everything looks good, and now we've chosen an image that deepens the understanding. Right, so here's the finished product in all of its glory. So I actually changed this to say science communication from the original image. It was originally website design, but here's the thing. These concepts are going to transfer pretty nicely. I'm going to put them in my own words, though, because some of these strategies are worded for the art world when they use phrases like white space, thinking that is some universal term that we all know. I want to give you a great example of effective science communication to start off. This is an abstract that was submitted with an abstract summary graphic, which I think is a great idea and it should be universal, but it's not. I think this is really well done, and I think it works so well in favor of the authors. So let's look at the graphic first. It's showing us some immune cell interactions to do with SARS-CoV-2. It has a key, which labels everything, and seeing something like this primes us for reading the actual abstract. If you're not as comfortable with reading about immunology, this figure breaks down a lot of the abstract using simple visuals. It eases you in, and then you can read the abstract. These are incredibly valuable in tandem with each other. Something else I tend to think about is that people can generally understand much more of an image like this than the corresponding abstract paragraph. I think visual communication is so important, especially for science, because not only do we need to communicate science, but we need to do this successfully, or it's not effective. I like to think of science as this kind of give and take between discovery and then communication. And that successful communication leads to others be able to discover more, so it's a big feedback loop dependent on effective communication. We also don't think about it too much, but we actually apply visual communication tactics regularly. When you take a huge spreadsheet of data and you create a graph, that's visual communication. We are representing information that seems nebulous and hard to digest to make it consumable. When we use bullet points or shorthand for things, we are breaking things down for people to follow more easily. Our brain likes to follow information in morsels. Think of it as leaving a breadcrumb trail as opposed to chucking full pieces of bread at somebody and hoping they are hungry enough to keep following you. This week in the Read Lab, our lab's weekly newsletter, Danny uses a lot of visual communication. She chunks all the information into sections that make sense, she uses bolding for people's names, and underlines crucial points. If we got a continuous paragraph of words, we would likely give up on reading the newsletter because it's much more overwhelming than it is helpful. So what I want you to take away from all of this is that graphics and visuals universalize information. They make something indigestible into something easy to digest, and that all levels the playing field. What I've done today is try to chunk this all into 3 main points so that we can try to grasp and think about simple overarching concepts we can use on the daily. There's a lot of wonderment with the graphics that I produce, but in short, I just have some rules of thumb in the back of my mind that helps me know how to make things look nice, so I'm going to try and boil them down and help you out. My 3 points that I've decided are good starting places are use of space, use of color, and using fonts. But that last one is a little bit shorter, so it's going to have less emphasis than the first 2, which is also why it's smaller. The use of space is going to have 4 main parts. Fill, don't overflow, only keep what you need, use emphasis, and use visual clues. Fill, don't overflow. We can see this means use the space you have, but don't make it too busy or else it will become more distracting and confusing than informative or helpful. Only keeping the needs, as in, is there enough to understand? Good, there shouldn't be anything else. Emphasis. As you can see, I emphasize the word emphasis with bolding and underlining, case in point, but this can be accomplished by using different font styles, making something bigger if it is more important, and smaller if it's less important. You can also use colors to make something stand out. I will talk more about colors in the color section though. Visual cues are important because although I don't think every picture is worth a literal 1,000 words, I do think they help tell a story, or collectively they contribute to one. They also help to break up words, but they don't always have to be a replacement of words. They can be when it makes sense, but a lot of the time I think it's good to use visuals to help support words instead of be their own lone standing thing. I have tidied up this graphic by filling up the space of the slide just enough, getting rid of some excess words, and emphasis has been established with the orange headers. We also have added some navy visual cues on the sides that don't really explain anything per se, but more so they just give us imagery to attach to the rules. So those are my quick and dirty rules for using space effectively. Now on to the use of color. My 5 points that I've decided were important enough to include are: there are guidelines, but not facts for color. Colors should be aesthetic, they should be effective, they should evoke feelings, and also you can use colors to create belonging in any kind of visual medium. Using colors together is a highly contentious thing, and so there have been all these color theories, like this one, that try to establish what goes with what and why, which can be a good guideline, but it shouldn't be a limiter for you. A lot of color palettes that work don't really abide to particular rules. So color theory, here you can see that different alignments of the color wheel, which is a very subjective wheel in my opinion, but it follows that sort of Roy G. Biv structure, and they're drawing different alignments across the color wheel and next to each other in the color wheel, just basically pointing out that these are different things that work well together. I think it's a fantastic way to find colors that work together if you are unsure where to start. But my main favorite way is to plagiarize, but with colors, so it's fine. On all softwares, they have so many ready-to-use palettes. If you scroll through all of them, you're gonna find something that you like or something that will give you a baseline to work with. People forget to even look for them, but all Microsoft programs, Canva, Adobe products, they all have these built-in palette features. RStudio even has those kinds of palettes online that you can look up and use within ggplot, for example. You can also just look at websites, paintings, logos, flyers that you like the color scheme of, and completely rip it off because no one can own colors. Here we have two examples of flyers that I've made. One is adjacent to the sort of complementary color scheme of red and green, but the other one isn't really following color theory. I think they both work. That's my basic point here. Moving on to the overused term of aesthetic. We shall boil it down to saying this fancy word with an A next to an E just means how something looks. The best way to see if an overall vibe works with itself and what it's supposed to be accomplishing is by asking people. And you might be thinking, shouldn't I ask an artist or somebody who knows all that kind of stuff? I don't know an artist. And you can ask them too, or try to find one. But a lot of this is subjective, and as long as the average person likes it, you don't really have to know all the details. It just means it works. The style of design, the thing that you're making the graphic for, and the colors should all match. Here we can see that the font is cute and pink, and the style and the candy colors in the flyer all gel with each other. The use of color should not only fit a theme, but they also should be effective. This means they should be doing some heavy lifting, including being thematically or emotionally relevant to what you're communicating, and also use colors for contrast and emphasis. On the right side, we can see some examples of fake logos from Canva. Wellness Leaf Health is imitating the color of oranges, the fruit. We can assume it's a wellness, nature-focused brand because of the bright but natural colors that are implicative of fruits. Avery Davis Real Estate is very clean and corporate with a limited color palette. You know they're serious and they aren't going to use orange colors that suggest anything fun or lackadaisical or happy. They're going to stay muted. They're focused on finding you a house or selling your property. The last logo is a barbecue restaurant logo, and rightfully so, it is a simple meat and fire color combo. The top to bottom transition is clear, the text is a charcoal color, and is visually where charcoals would be. It's all going to look right to someone whether they know why or not. Another color theory is about emotional significance of colors and how they impact the person observing the colors. While I don't fully agree with this, I think that culture, upbringing, associations personal to you, and much more can influence our emotional associations with colors, and this is therefore something we can't make a general call about. These trends are kind of overarchingly true, but I like to think about color as so much more and so different per person. That going with what looks right in the context is much more important than picking brown to channel rugged trustworthiness, for example. Grouping colors together and making what's called a palette is effective to create harmony and belonging within any sort of graphic or slide deck or drawing. It does two things that I like. You can logically use colors, for example, creating like with like patterns. In this Task 2R38 diagram I made, I specifically used the parental color schemes to then show on the egg, sperm cell level which parent is contributing which protein. The information being conveyed without words is mom equals green, dad equals blue. The offspring being a blue-green was a logical jump from here. Another thing that using different colors in a palette can do is create eye breaks by not just being hit with a wall of one color. Even though this diagram is using kind of things that are adjacent to each other, so blues and teals and greens, it still works because of the relationships that the subject matter has to the color coding. The best way to use this knowledge I just discussed is to look at real work in science communication. In this case, I'm going to absolutely obliterate someone else's science diagram with my own visual rule system. So let's harken back to the beginning when I discussed the use of space. So here are 3 egregious breaches of the space rules. This one box on the top right is just sticking out like a tiny branch on a lopsided tree. They need to figure out how to tuck this or create some kind of congruency and flow to this diagram. Now on the top left, they've crammed in another box text next to some words they are practically overlapping. Why is some text boxed and some not? Beats me. If you're using space effectively, you shouldn't have to outline your text like a fence around a yard. We shouldn't be that confused looking at your diagram. In the cell ID chart part, they actually overlap the diagram and obscured the text. It looks really bad. Now, for color, Overall, there's no palette or color system in use here. They repeat colors, they are starting with some more natural or at least physiological relevant colors and then quickly take us down a rabbit hole of neons, which is not my leaning in any situation, but especially not the human body. It looks like a rave instead of a viral infection. Exceptions for that neon comment would be if they had fluorescently tagged proteins or cell diagrams in another figure in the paper and the fluorescent colors somehow lined up with that other piece of data, but honestly, even if that were the case, this diagram is still a mess and looks awful. Font usage is pretty easy to cover, so I only have 2 slides for this. Something I don't see very often is the use of multiple fonts in presentations or really any scientific communication context. It has been really hard for me to get any scientist to part with Arial, but using different fonts can add contrast and intrigue to a visual, which is similar to why we vary colors. In my presentation right now, my titles for my slides are in a completely different font and font style from my body text. I often do that because I think it's much more pleasing, and there seems to be a clear hierarchy and diversity to the slide with a simple font mixture. Now, you want to choose fonts that are appropriate for the setting. My examples here are showing that fonts can bring a lot to something. They can be used to set emotional tones or draw the eye somewhere on the page. I think that 3 fonts max, perhaps organized as title, subtitle, and body text, is good. That's my rule of thumb, but since I constantly argue with other people's rules of thumb, I understand why you might disagree with this. I think as long as there is a clear system of font usage, it's okay. Let's go back to our logo examples from before. The font in the wellness brand is both giving modern and science-literate feelings, which partnered with the leaf drawing and the natural color scheme just screams, we do health and wellness, but you can trust we aren't selling suspect vitamins. And the thing is, a logo or a brand aesthetic can be so effective that you can convince people of something just because what you're showing them looks professional. That's why all of this is so important for scientists. Obviously, used in a nefarious manner, for sure not great, but if you are presenting to obtain funding or showing people why a new scientific method can be revolutionary, you want their attention and their trust. The second logo is bold and strong. It's inaccessible, legible, and it gives off a strong neighborhood joint vibes. Lastly, the real estate logo is professional and corporate, still down to the font choice. They are simple and very thin lettering. It isn't bold and commanding the way the barbecue logo is, but it's giving me the feeling of we don't need to scream about how good we are at selling properties. We have a house in the logo. Just give us your money and we'll do a good job. I'm only doing this whole comparison to an actual classic art piece to point out congruency between the things I'm discussing and the roots of art and aesthetic communication. The number one thing is we have contrast and emphasis throughout the painting by color variation. The dark background highlights and brings into focus the face and the lady that we're looking at. The color palette is working in our favor here. It's all very natural hues, almost sepia toned the whole way through, except for this wonderful blue headscarf detail. And this blue is pulling our gaze to her and her face. The spacing of this piece is very in line with our internal ones. We have space around her, her face, the pinnacle of the painting is very centralized. We can also see textural differences between the clothing or scarves and her face. Her earring, for example, is very shiny. So now let's come full circle and compare those concepts to a more relevant visual medium. Contrast and emphasis, we can see that the vaccine here is a bright white and yellow highlighted on a darker blue background. There's an effective drop shadow, which is a great hack to increase contrast. Effective color palettes in this picture, there is a good blue versus warmer color schemes, lots of yellows, oranges, reds, and even pinks. And although there are a lot of different colors, we can see that they are all being used to represent distinct entities and are important to the science communication of the figure. The warmer, fiery colors really stand out against the blue, but they look great doing it, not clashy. We can see that the spacing is effective. The diagram is moving in a circular motion and is spaced out within the circular cell. There is not a part of the diagram where everything is happening and then contrasted with complete dead zones. It's easy to follow and it's nicely spaced out. Lastly, let's look at textural differences. They've cleverly applied this paper-thick texture to the cell, the background, and then made all the focus points of what's happening on the molecular level very smooth and sleek. It's a great tactic to introduce a division in addition to the colors with texture. Now for my favorite part of the PowerPoint, where I get to air all of my pet peeves about visual communication. Number 1 is crushing images. If you have a space to fill and it doesn't fit an image, do not crush it. You may either crop it to fit the space, or you may downsize the overall picture to fit the width or height restraint. Do not crush. This is not an option. It looks so bad, and to me it screams, oh, this person doesn't understand how to work the controls in PowerPoint. That does not endear me to whatever information you are trying to tell me, because I no longer trust your abilities. My second pet peeve is using inexact but vaguely congruent colors. If I have a pie chart and it's got all these lovely bright colors like you can see here, I'm going to highlight one part of the data. So let's say the happy faces, and I'm going to color code my text to match. I need to actually pick the correct color. I'm not going to pick a cousin or a friend of the color thinking that no one will notice. It's lazy, and I will notice. This is the color the text is compared to the diagram. It's so bad. Either don't even try to make the color similar, or go all in and use the eyedropper tool. It's the easiest way to know for sure that you are actually getting the color you think you are. Number 3, full paragraphs and sentences on your PowerPoint or any kind of chart that is supposed to be quickly getting someone on the same page as you. It's so overwhelming. People can only read a paragraph or listen to what you're saying. If you give them a paragraph to read, you've lost approximately half your audience to reading, and the other half is thinking about how that's too much text and how they feel overwhelmed. The last one is don't do dark on dark, or its less offensive friend, light on light. It is not effective. My personal rage with this is very much directed at black on red and red on black usage, because I see this so often. What actually pops is contrast, not value. The values may have contrast as well, like a light yellow and a dark blue have contrast, but the contrast is the important part, not the fact that one is yellow and one is blue. Light on light is a less severe crime, but it is still a crime. This does not pop. These two work great. It's a small rule, but it goes a long way. I wanted to end with some great tools that I love that can completely up your game in terms of graphics and visual communication. The first one is defont.com. It is a free online source of many, many fonts that you can search through and download for free. They have a plethora of categories. If I were designing a video game that was about medieval times, for instance, then I can select Gothic, Medieval, scroll down. Oh, I really like this cardinal one, so I click, I download it. It downloads a zip file. I can extract and install the fonts. When we download someone's custom font design, it doesn't usually allow us to use the bold, italicize, caps functions within Microsoft to alter the font in our normal way. So they usually provide separate font downloads for bold, light, or different versions of the text. The second tool I love so much is Canva. I have Canva Pro, and there are so many uses for it. I recommend assessing its usefulness with the free version first. If you find that you're like me and keep wanting to use the Pro included graphics, etc., then eventually you can consider that cost and make the decision. But the framework of using it doesn't change at all from free to Pro. Let me just show you some of the great things about Canva by clicking on a presentation and letting it show me all the templates and suggestions here. Basically, all these different users create these templates by hand, and then you'll have access to them. I don't usually just use one and write into the template, but if I'm stuck, I definitely peruse and try to draw fresh inspiration. Elements are for if you're trying to add in pieces and images. There are GIFs, photos, videos, pretty much any visual element you could think of and try to find on Google Images, except that Canva is a hub for visual artists, so the work is higher quality. I like to draw a lot of my own graphics and upload them directly into my account here in the Uploads tab. Then all of those images are always accessible to me for the rest of time I have logged into my account. Amazing for things like the Monel M PNG, which I have saved into my uploads. The third tool is Coolors, which is something I use if I get stuck with colors, which I often do run out of color inspiration. Sometimes just clicking through the palettes will show me a color or a match of colors that I haven't really seen or thought of, and it leads me down a new path. But it's lovely for selecting a palette if you have literally no inclinations at all. You can also click on the color bars if you really like certain colors and want to lock them into place but see the rest of the palette change. So I'll do that here, and we can see if I keep refreshing, I can change all the other colors in the palette but keep these two locked in place. My last tool, lest we forget, PowerPoint. PowerPoint actually has a lot to work with, even though we may just use the day-to-day survival functions. Before, I had Adobe, because those kinds of products are expensive, and if you aren't trained to use them, they are very, very daunting and not very user-friendly. I would often use PowerPoint. I drew shapes and constructed diagrams. Once I drew a mouse surgery diagram in PowerPoint by hand. Is it more painstaking? Yeah. Can it work if you're intimidated or just dipping your toe in the water of design? Also yes. I also prefer PowerPoint for creating presentations overall. Yes, Canva, Google Docs, and all of those different softwares have presentation functions, but there's something about Microsoft PowerPoint, and I stand by that. So that's the end of my presentation about visual communication and science. I hope that you've learned a lot, and I hope that you can just take these tools with you, both the ones that I showed right at the end, and also the rules of thumb that I use in my day-to-day designing.